Operation Market Garden. On Sunday, the 17th of September 1944, the largest squadron of troop transport aircraft ever assembled for a single operation took off from several airfields in southern England. It was the 263rd week of the Second World War, and the Allied commander, General Dwight David Eisenhower, was launching Operation Market Garden, which ended in failure, costing thousands of soldiers' lives who were caught by the Germans. To everyone's surprise, it was a combined air and land offensive conceived by one of the most cautious Allied commanders, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Market, the aerial phase of the operation, was going to be impressive, with the participation of nearly 5,000 fighters, bombers, transports, and more than 2,500 gliders. Precisely at 1:30 p.m. that Sunday, in an unprecedented daylight attack, the entire Allied airborne army with its vehicles and equipment began to withdraw behind the German lines. This bold and historic invasion from the sky had one objective: the Netherlands occupied by the Nazis. On land, aligned along the border between Belgium and the Netherlands, were the Garden Forces, the combat vehicle columns of the British Second Army. At 2:35 p.m., preceded by artillery fire and swarms of fighters launching rockets, the armoured units began their assault on the backbone of the Netherlands along a strategic corridor that the paratroopers were already trying to dominate and keep open. Montgomery's ambitious plan intended to move the troops and tanks through the Netherlands, cross the Rhine, and penetrate into Germany itself. Operation Market Garden, the Field Marshal reasoned, was the decisive strike they needed to bring down the Third Reich and achieve the end of the war in 1944, but this did not turn out entirely well for the Allies. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. Operation Market Garden remains one of the most controversial Allied actions of the Second World War. This controversy, to a large extent, can be explained by the British perception of the operation as a glorious national failure, a unique event that encompasses all the elements of a great tragedy. As previously mentioned, Operation Market Garden was the idea of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and his association with the operation is one of its main appeals to the British public. Even considered by his most ardent supporters as one of the darkest stains on his military record, the operation has come to overshadow many of Montgomery's European successes. The issue of Montgomery's reputation, combined with the aspects surrounding the romanticism of a bold operation, in which ground troops participate in a race against time to relieve the besieged airborne forces of three nations, partly explains why the episode has been so irresistible to the attention of academics, soldiers, and the media, and continues to captivate the public. Although the Battle of Normandy was a disaster for Adolf Hitler and the German military command, in attempting to halt the Allied advance in France, the Germans suffered very significant casualties, and on the 3rd of September 1944, both Paris and Brussels had been liberated. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, employed a broad front strategy during the campaign, and the speed of the Allied advance during the late summer led many Allied soldiers to believe that the war in Europe was practically won. However, Eisenhower's success during this period was hiding a series of growing problems that needed to be resolved with some urgency. These problems, ironically, were largely caused by the success of the Allied advance through France and Belgium, as was being discovered by Montgomery's 21st Army Group, led by the British Second Army. The 30 Corps of Lieutenant General Sir Brian Horrocks, the spearhead of the Second Army, was advancing in late August at the astonishing speed of 80 kilometers per day, a pace of advance that simply could not be sustained with supplies that had to be brought in from the beaches of Normandy, about 480 kilometers behind. However, stopping to resupply would have given the Germans exactly the respite they needed to reorganize, a situation that Montgomery thought could be avoided if Eisenhower allowed a narrow front offensive by the 21st Army Group to open the German front before a rapid advance towards Berlin. Montgomery continually insisted to Eisenhower that he reorient his strategy starting from mid-August, but it was in vain. And on the 4th of September, the advance of the Second Army was halted in Antwerp due to a lack of supplies. However, 6 days after this loss of Allied momentum, Eisenhower finally acquiesced to some of Montgomery's wishes and to a plan that intended to use Lieutenant General Louis Brereton's Allied 1st Airborne Army, which was in reserve in Great Britain, to put the Second Army back in motion. Operation Market Garden intended to insert 3 airborne divisions behind enemy lines to seize a series of vital bridges in the Netherlands through which the Second Army would advance. The United States 101st Airborne Division, Screaming Eagles, around Eindhoven. The United States 82nd Airborne Division, All-American, around Nijmegen. And the British 1st Airborne Division, with the British 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade, attached around Arnhem. The objective was to pave the way for the capture of the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, and to end the war in Europe within a few months. Planning began immediately, on the 10th of September, and the operation was to take place only 7 days later. The Germans facing this Allied onslaught were the German Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model. Under his command, Model used the scarce forces of Colonel General Kurt Student's 1st Parachute Army and General Gustav von Zangen's 15th Army to defend up to Nijmegen, while Kampfgruppe von Tettau and Lieutenant General Willy Bittrich's 2nd Panzer SS Corps, specialists in defending against airborne landings, were positioned around Arnhem. The 2 battered armoured divisions that made up Bittrich's 2nd Panzer SS Corps, the 9th Panzer SS Division and the 10th Armoured SS Division, had no more than 3,000 men each, and only had about 12 operational tanks between the two. As a consequence, they were reorganized as SS Kampfgruppe Hohenstaufen and SS Kampfgruppe Frundsberg, respectively. A Kampfgruppe or battle group is an improvised formation smaller than a division. The Allies were aware of the German weaknesses, although the euphoria of their rapid advance and the amount of information reaching various headquarters tended to cloud intelligence waters. However, the information obtained by Ultra was reliable, and the 21st Army Group had a good understanding of enemy forces and dispositions. Although not aware of the intelligence, the Allied 1st Airborne Army knew of the existence of the SS 2nd Panzer Corps in Arnhem and that it was very weak. However, although the commanders of Operation Market Garden did not necessarily lack information about the enemy, many underestimated what the enemy was still capable of achieving. Model had created order out of chaos very quickly, and faced with defenders of the caliber of Student and Bittrich, Allied optimism was not well founded. On Sunday, the 17th of September, it was warm, dry and sunny, ideal conditions for an airborne assault. During the night and morning, the aviation fields and German anti-aircraft defenses were attacked by heavy bombers from the Bomber Command and the United States 8th Air Force, and swarms of Allied fighters and fighter bombers continued attacking the German anti-aircraft artillery until the airborne divisions began landing in the Netherlands around 1 o'clock p.m. Shortly after 2 o'clock p.m., about 20,000 combat soldiers, 511 vehicles, 330 artillery pieces, and 590 tons of material had landed safely. The parachute drops and glider landings were very precise and highly concentrated. The air bridge was an extraordinary success. Meanwhile, the main element of the 30 Corps, the Guards Armoured Division, initiated the ground part of the operation and began advancing along the Eindhoven road from Neerpelt. To the west of Arnhem, the landing of Brigadier Pip Hicks's 1st Air Brigade in 320 gliders and the landing of Brigadier Gerald's 2,278 men. Brigadier Lathbury's 1st Parachute Brigade was very successful and encountered very little German opposition. While the airborne landing troops were preparing to defend their landing zones for the second landing, the paratroopers were preparing to march towards their objectives following 3 coded routes. The 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment was to advance along the Leopard route to seize the elevated ground north of Arnhem. The 2nd Battalion, followed by the headquarters of the 1st Parachute Brigade, was to head along the Lion route and take the Arnhem Railway Bridge and the Arnhem Road Bridge. The 3rd Battalion was to advance along the Tiger route and assist at the Arnhem Road Bridge. The first opposition encountered by the 1st Parachute Brigade was going to have significant consequences for the Battle of Arnhem. In the forests of Wolfhiese, near the landing zones, 435 men of an SS battalion commanded by Commander Sepp Kraft were training. Kraft, quickly assessed the situation and realized that time was essential. This immediately stopped the jeeps of a significant assault force, Major Freddie Guff's reconnaissance squadron, which had been sent along the Leopard route to seize the Arnhem Road Bridge. When the 1st Battalion followed them a little later and found the route blocked, it desperately attempted to flank craft from the north but eventually gave up and headed southeast towards Oosterbeek. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion and the 3rd Battalion were marching towards Arnhem. As they advanced, there was little to stop them, but they were not moving quickly enough for Urquhart or Lathbury's liking, a problem exacerbated by a radio failure, which led both men to leave their headquarters to personally urge the battalions. The two commanders finally met in Oosterbeek behind the 3rd Battalion, which was stalling as it encountered more improvised opposition from the SS Kampfgruppe Spindler, and Urquhart found himself unable to return to headquarters. From the 1st Parachute Brigade, only Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion made substantial progress, and even then, their target, the railway bridge, was blown up as they approached it. However, the battalion's relative speed meant that when most of them reached the Arnhem Road Bridge that afternoon, they found it virtually deserted. Although attempts to cross the bridge were thwarted by a German stronghold on the other end, by the end of the day, Frost maintained a comfortable defensive position in the northern end, formed by 750 men, including Company C of the 3rd Battalion, which had managed to slip through the German defences, and some men from Guff's reconnaissance squadron. Also, by the end of September 17th, the Guards Armoured Division had managed to break through the outer shell of the German defences around the Dutch border, with the support of the Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force firing rockets, and had reached Valkenswaard with the loss of 9 tanks. However, the critical bridge at Sonn had been blown up, despite the attempts of the 101st Airborne Division to capture it intact, and the Germans' ability to halt the attack of the 30 Corps became evident in the early hours of the battle. They were advancing along a single narrow road that made it relatively easy for the Germans to hinder the advance of the 30 Corps. Traffic jams were common, and resupplying the forward elements proved extremely difficult. Therefore, the British ground forces had to make use of all the combat experience and skill that had cost them so much to forge their way. The next day, reinforcements arrived. The following day, reinforcements from the 3 airborne divisions arrived. At 3:00 p.m. on the 18th of September, to the west of Arnhem, the 4th Parachute Brigade, the divisional troops and the rest of the 1st Airborne Brigade landed on Dutch soil. However, the resupply drop that took place shortly after their arrival was of very limited use, as the drop zone had fallen into German hands. At that moment, Hicks, who had taken command of the division in the absence of Urquhart, sent the 2nd Regiment of South Staffordshire, one of the airborne landing battalions, and the 11th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment to reinforce the 1st Battalion and the 3rd Battalion, which were attempting to make their way to the bridge from the west, near the Santa Isabel Hospital. In this confusing street fighting, Lathbury was wounded, and Urquhart was forced to take refuge in an attic. In this critical phase of the battle, the division could not afford to have its commander absent from command. On Monday morning, an attack by another German formation, the Kampfgruppe von Tettau from the west, also occurred, and thus the 1st British Airborne Division gradually found itself surrounded. At the bridge, however, Frost still felt confident despite probing attacks from the north by the SS Kampfgruppe Knaust, part of the Hohenstaufen formation. This confidence increased further when around 9:30 a.m., about 22 vehicles of the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion returned from Nijmegen and attempted to cross the bridge. The first vehicles managed to reach the north side, but those that followed did not. In a battle that lasted several hours, the airborne troops stopped the Germans on the bridge ramp. The battle in Arnhem certainly had not progressed according to Allied plans. But on the afternoon of the 18th of September, the 30 Corps had linked up with the 101st Airborne Division and had reached the Sun Bridge, where they immediately began constructing a Bailey Bridge. Meanwhile, the 82nd Airborne Division, which had secured its other target bridges, attempted to take the Nijmegen Road Bridge, but the German defences held firm. Tuesday, the 19th of September, brought little good news for the 1st British Airborne Division. Bad weather frustrated attempts to blow up the Polish brigade, and prevented Allied fighter bombers from providing close air support to Urquhart's forces. The attack by the 4th Parachute Brigade, supported by another airborne landing battalion, the 7th King's Own Scottish Borderers, was stopped in the forests north of Oosterbeek. The 1st Airborne Division now depended on air supplies dropped by RAF transport squadrons, but the Germans quickly reinforced their anti-aircraft defences around the drop zones. The transport crews displayed immense bravery by repeatedly attempting their missions, flying very low to achieve precision through intense anti-aircraft fire. Flight Lieutenant David Lord was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery as the captain of a Dakota that was shot down during one of these missions on the 19th of September. Several attacks around the Santa Isabel Hospital by a mix of units, although they freed Urquhart from his attic to resume command, failed to break through to Frost at the Arnhem Bridge. These failures caused Urquhart to withdraw the remnants of his division to their headquarters at the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek. During this period, notable acts of bravery occurred throughout the battlefield, such as those of Captain Lionel Queripel of the 10th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment and Commander Robert Kane of the 2nd Regiment of South Staffordshire. Both were later awarded the Victoria Cross, Queripel posthumously. Frost's men on the bridge were also under increasing pressure. German air raids, bombings and mortar fire from the north and east inflicted numerous casualties on the airborne troops. But despite ammunition, food and water running low, little ground was lost. Now Frost was clear that it was unlikely the rest of the division would reinforce him and that he had to hold out as long as possible with very scarce resources and wait for the arrival of the 30 Corps. The Guards Armoured Division was advancing towards Arnhem. It crossed the newly built Sun Bailey Bridge and reached Grave that same morning. But the 30 Corps' advance lacked momentum. The Guards Armoured Division, leading the British ground attack along with some American airborne troops, attacked the Nijmegen Bridge again that afternoon to clear the way for the battle tanks. But once again the German defenders were too strong. Brigadier Jumping Jim Gavin, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, was so intent on clearing the path in front of the 30 Corps that he ordered an assault across the Waal River to take the bridge from both ends. However, his men needed boats and had to carry them through the traffic-clogged highway. Time, clearly, was as much an enemy of the Allies during Market Garden as the Germans themselves, and Model knew this. With increasing German pressure on the 1st Airborne Division and no signs of the imminent arrival of the 30 Corps, Urquhart decided on the 20th of September to defend a thumb-shaped perimeter in Oosterbeek, with his base on the river. It was during these combats that Sergeant John Baskyfield held the enemy at bay with 6-pound anti-tank guns. The fact that the troops continued fighting on the Arnhem Bridge undoubtedly relieved some pressure on Urquhart's position, but Frost's men were suffering as the Germans systematically destroyed their buildings. The fragmented nature of the battle also meant that coordinating the defense became increasingly difficult, and it did not help that Frost himself was wounded. Gough took command of the remaining men, and although he was able to negotiate a truce to evacuate some of the wounded into German care, he knew the defenders could not fight much longer. During the fighting, Lieutenant John Greyburn, platoon commander of the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, demonstrated extraordinary courage over 4 days and was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. When the main tanks of the 30 Corps crossed the Waal that afternoon, following the successful assault by the men of the 82nd Parachute Brigade in crossing the river, the relentless and airborne attacks by the Guards Armoured Division were close enough to see the smoke rising from Arnhem. But despite being only 8 miles from the city, the exhausted Guards Armoured Division, without infantry support or air cover and lacking artillery ammunition, stopped for the night. At the Arnhem Bridge, fighting continued during the morning of the 21st of September, but faded as the airborne troops were overwhelmed. With the bridge open to German traffic, the SS Kampfgruppe Knaust ran across and established defensive positions south of Arnhem in Elst to stop the 30 Corps. Meanwhile, in the perimeter of Oosterbeek, Urquhart's men struggled to hold their positions. That morning, an attack by the Kampfgruppe von Tettau expelled the 3rd Airborne Landing Battalion and the division's last reserve, the 1st Border Regiment, from the heights of Westerbouwing. the crucial elevated terrain that dominated the division's perimeter base, the lled ferry, out of service at that time, and the town of Driel on the far bank of the lower Rhine. From these heights, German fire could dominate any attempt to cross the river. The fact that the 1st Airborne Division was not overwhelmed that day was largely due to the advance of the 30 Corps to Elst and the subsequent skill with which their artillery fired around the perimeter to suppress German attacks. While the battle for Elst raged that afternoon, most of the 1st Polish Parachute Brigade, delayed since Tuesday, descended on Driel under intense German fire. That night, the Polish troops planned to cross the lower Rhine to reinforce the perimeter, but, like the American airborne troops on the Waal the previous day, first had to wait for the arrival of assault boats. A brigade from the 43rd Division, Wessex, attacked towards Driel the next morning, Friday the 22nd of September, and completed the link between the 30 Corps and the airborne forces. But it was not a time for complacency, as Urquhart's division was in a precarious situation and desperately needed reinforcements. That afternoon, 35 Poles managed to cross to Lled in 4 rubber boats and joined the perimeter defense, but so few made little difference to the division's prospects. As they crossed, the German commanders planned the final destruction of Urquhart's men for the following day. These German attempts to destroy the perimeter on Saturday, the 23rd of September, were thwarted not only by the 30 Corps' cannons, but also by the close air support of the RAF's Typhoons, which was finally possible thanks to improved weather. By this time, the combats in Oosterbeek had become infantry probes, snipers, and mortar attacks, and the exhausted troops on both sides struggled to stay awake. However, the superiority of German fire was becoming noticeable, and, as at the Arnhem Bridge, the threat of being overrun was ever present. At dusk, another 200 Poles crossed the river and submerged into the perimeter, but the next day Urquhart was clear that his division would have to be evacuated soon. A medical truce on Sunday, the 24th of September, allowed 1,200 wounded, many of whom were threatened with being burned alive in the basements of the buildings in which they were sheltering, to be handed over to German medical personnel. Thus, at the end of a day in which the Germans launched 15 of their heaviest tanks, the Panzerkampfwagen Mark 6 version B King Tiger, against the eastern side of the perimeter, Urquhart was left with only 1,800 soldiers. There was much activity in Lled during the night of the 24th to the 25th of September, when 315 men of the 4th Regiment of Dorsetshire, part of the 43rd Division, crossed the lower Rhine and briefly controlled part of Westerboing. But the German armoured and infantry forces were slowly infiltrating the airborne positions, and the withdrawal across the lower Rhine, Operation Berlin, had to be carried out that same night. At 9:00 p.m., the evacuation began with an artillery bombardment by the 30 Corps that lasted 11 hours. British and Canadian engineers with 37 boats began crossing the river. Leaving the wounded behind with volunteers, the 1st Airborne Division withdrew to the riverbank through the perimeter base that was barely 750 yards wide. Although the Germans continued to fire mortars, the darkness and heavy rain concealed the evacuation, and there was no attempt to attack and defeat Urquhart's men. The small boats made many trips across the lower Rhine that night, and only stopped when dawn made it too dangerous to continue. With the end of Operation Berlin also came the end of Operation Market Garden, which had cost 1,485 Allied lives. The cost of Operation Market Garden, especially because it did not achieve its objectives, was very high. The reasons for this failure are countless and clearly show many of the difficulties involved in successfully organizing airborne assaults dependent on rapid relief by ground forces. However, although in hindsight it is easy to say that Market Garden should never have taken place, we must remember the circumstances in which the operation was conceived, planned, and carried out. With the Germans in retreat, September of 1944 was the time to carry out a bold operation to shorten the war, and bold decisions had to be made quickly if the opportunity was not to be lost. Market Garden was a plan conceived wisely at the right time, but ultimately It was a flawed plan in too many aspects to be a success. Nevertheless, for the 1st British Airborne Division that held out for so long during the Battle of Arnhem, it will always be seen as a victory.